Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
On
Becker.
On the Declaration, Carl Becker writes a book on the Declaration of Independence in which he says to ask if the principles of the Declaration of Independence are true is to ask a meaningless question. Retail, but only for pickup. So, you can go to PacSun to get the latest T-shirt, Spencer, but you're going to have to pick it up outside. I'm sorry. That was a low blow.
Roasted in this opening. I mean, gosh.
I've shopped at PacSun. It's just been a decade.
I'm wearing Banana Republic right now.
I'm joking. I'm joking. I took Latin in middle school, and my mother got me a Latin for all occasions book, and I think my favorite one was Semper Ub Sub Ubi, which
Semper Ubi Sub Ubi.
Always wear underwear.
Always wear underwear. Correct.
Welcome once again, everyone, to the Roundtable, the editors and publishers podcast of The American Mind, published by yours truly, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute. I'm joined, as always, by Spencer Clavin, assistant editor of the Claremont Review Books and The American Mind, David Barr, managing editor of The American Mind, Matthew Peterson, vice president of education, and founding editor of The American Mind. Sadly, Dr. Pulitzer cannot join us today. James is at an undisclosed secure location, but he just couldn't join us. So you'll have to put up with just the four of us today. Just a few announcements by way of housekeeping. Remind everyone that our own Spencer Clavin is the host of The Close Read, the Claremont Review Books podcast. Spencer, are the new episodes out yet or almost?
No, they're not. But the new issue's out, and then we'll be releasing new episodes sort of month by month as the issue exists.
Right. That makes sense, yeah. Mm-hmm. Our spring issue of the Claremont Review Books should be in your mailbox, or almost. I got mine on Monday. The mail's a little screwy right now, so if you don't get it, don't panic. But it is all of it free, available online. Usually we spend the quarter releasing some stuff behind the paywall gradually, but we decided while we're all confined to quarters, as our editor put it in the announcement, we wanted to provide everyone with the full issue to read free and clear. If you don't subscribe, you should. It's the finest publication in conservative thought around. And I don't just say that because I pay the staff.
As I've taken to saying, perhaps ill-advisedly, on the CRB podcast, if you don't subscribe, what's wrong with you?
Yeah, Spencer prefers the vinegar. I go for the honey, but that's okay.
The accusatory tone is always my model.
And then in our final segment today, we're going to talk about 1619 and the abomination that is it getting a Pulitzer, among other things, but which was announced this week. But that should lead you all to our special 1619 podcast. It's an hour and a half, 2 parts of wonderful commentary on precisely what is wrong with that project as a matter of politics, as a matter of history. We involve great scholars from the Claremont orbit and others, including one of our founding board members, Christopher Flannery, who taught for many years at Azusa Pacific. And I should also mention runs another podcast, his own creative project, a project at the Claremont Institute called The American Story. So check out the americanstorypodcast.org as well. Chris Flannery, Alan Geltzo, the famous Lincoln historian, of course, talks a bit on our podcast special. Lucas Morell, longtime faculty member of the fellowship programs for us in the summer, who teaches at Washington and Lee University. And then our board chairman, Tom Klingenstein, who's an amateur historian in his own right and an accomplished amateur playwright as well, has a few plays that have been in production off-Broadway in New York on Abraham Lincoln, among other topics. And, of course, the inimitable Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House. And everyone forgets that it's Dr. Gingrich to you, sir. He has a PhD in history and taught in Georgia before he upended Congress and starting in 94. So anyway, with all that, thanks as always for listening and reading, and let's get into the show. I wanted to start with a favorite old topic of mine, one that's close to the hearts of CRB and Claremont Institute folks in general. And I'll just open it by reading this headline from the Washington Post, which is, top Republican fundraiser and Trump ally named postmaster general, giving president new influence over postal service. To which I say, finally, we're one step closer to the spoils system of old. The postmaster general, of course, was the plum in the whole spoils system, mostly because you got to dole out a lot of spoils yourself as you picked all of your assistant postmasters, or at least helped put them up to the president from your machine politics. I should explain all this a bit to folks who are confused maybe by this. But, a long time ago in American politics, we ushered in a whole new crop of executive officials with every administration. The political party machines had their members, all of whom paid dues, and there was a huge changing of the guard with every presidential administration. Now, this was open to abuse, of course. Corruption bleeds into any system, especially if it sits there long enough. But I think many of us at the Claremont Institute would argue that our modern alternative, which grew out of the perfectly reasonable desire to introduce a bit more of merit-based hiring in the federal administration, a advance of which Alexander Hamilton would be perfectly happy to endorse. He famously said in The Federalist, "A government badly administered can go by no other name than a bad government." So that's important. Maybe the spoils system got a little out of control. But what we have now today is this giant federal administrative state and a giant federal bureaucracy, which is unionized, a thing that Democrats of old, from FDR to JFK, said would be absurd to unionize public employees, but yet here we are. It's unionized, and the turnover annually is less than 1%. There's this great old story from a former director of housing and urban development who came into Claremont's orbit at one time, and he told me the story. He came across this employee whose wages were being garnished to pay for something, and he thought this was odd. So he dug into it, and it was to pay for a laptop that had been stolen by a Thai prostitute when he was overseas with his government laptop. So he looked into this, and he decided to initiate a firing procedure because the guy was clearly, among other sins, that being one of them, the guy was pretty useless, did just the bare minimum. It was obvious he was phoning it in for years. It took him 18 months to fire this guy, of course. And then when he finally got him fired, he'd get calls like once a week from around the executive branch saying, it became a thing of lore. Like, you actually fired somebody. How did you do that? He had to admit that, but for the taking government property into illegal activity in Thailand and getting it stolen, it probably wouldn't have happened. So it's my long-winded way of saying the spoils system wasn't all bad. Another story, Matt loves these old Harry Jaffa stories, so I'll tell this one too. So Harry Jaffa's father ran a nightclub in Manhattan.
Oh, yes.
They of course, grew up in Brooklyn. And his Harry Jaffa's sort of common sense diagnosis of the modern administrative state was through his father's very practical experience, which was civil service reform has been terrible for me in New York. I used to just pay off one guy. Now I have all these bureaucrats, climbing all over the place. I can't get anything done. I have to pay them in various ways through fees, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just much less efficient, and it's raising my cost of doing business, and this is no good. And then I just want to point people to this one piece in the British paper. It's rare to see these kind of hit pieces in British papers, but it is what it is. It was a little interesting. And the headline is, while everyone's distracted by coronavirus, Trump Trump's quietly taking personal control of an agency he shouldn't be going anywhere near. And they're called...
Just the headline alone.
Touch thou not the Postal Service, Donald J. Trump.
Well, this is actually about the Office of Personnel Management, which is...
this is a new...
right.
This is even worse. This is not just... This is all personnel.
So OPM has traditionally kind of, in many ways, run this civil service, or at least looked after its hiring and firing practices and its union practices, et cetera, et cetera. And it has ossified into a guardian of civil servants over the years. And famously in the Reagan administration, they wanted to shake things up by going after it. And it looks like Trump's doing that again. So this is all...
Infamously, Ryan, the Chinese hacked OPM under Obama.
That's right. Yeah,
he did nothing.
I'd forgotten about that. Thanks, David.
Sorry.
No. The Chinese hacked OPM and downloaded personal information from, I think,
anybody that has a clearance. I have a top secret clearance. They have all my stuff, all my relatives, everybody that I put down on my SF-86 or whatever it's called. They were
probably colluding with Russia to get that information.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot about reforming the administrative state. I think one big part of it is to find some new happy medium between the mostly insulated bureaucracy these days and the old way of doing business. And those who know me well will not be surprised to learn that one of our documents in this regard should be William Howard Taft's 1926 opinion, Myers v. United States, which dealt with, wait for it, a postmaster.
I waited for it, and I'm glad I did.
Ryan Williams has a dissertation
on William Howard Taft.
Yeah, so...
look for the future release from...
Yeah, the Wilson administration wanted to remove postmasters to, as one of a spoils position. They wanted to put their own people in, and lo and behold, they ran up against the Tenure of Office Act, which was meant as a corrective to Andrew Johnson's abuses after Lincoln was assassinated, and he was recalcitrant in enacting the radical Republicans' agenda in Congress. So Congress passed this Tenure of Office Act, which conditioned a lot of offices, their removal. So it used to be that everyone could be removed by the president, but then after the Tenure of Office Act, they basically made removal contingent upon Senate approval of a president's removal. And basically, put everyone into this bucket of for cause. So you couldn't remove someone unless they did this narrowly defined number of things. These days, it boils down to commit a felony, bribe somebody or otherwise do something gravely immoral. And this is most of our independent administrative state is built on this precedent. Taft, of course, said it was unconstitutional and then was overruled after his death about 10 years later in a case called Humphrey's Executor, which said, the president can remove somebody, but if they, more or less, but if they exercise quasi-judicial or quasi-legislative powers, then Congress can condition their removal. And so it's really just that one case upon which our whole administrative state is built. And it's been an active and live issue in the courts and will continue to be so. It's wrapped up in some of these abominations from Elizabeth Warren, like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which, not only is its head not removable, but it funds itself through fees it collects. It's just an abomination. So kudos to the Trump administration for trying to reassert some control. Any real reform, of course, has to go through Congress. And so that's going to be a 100-year struggle.
Man, we chat before we start recording about what we're going to talk about for the podcast, but you did not tell us, Ryan, that you were going to whip out that Thailand story. That's news. That's news to me. That's new on me, and I never heard it before. I have been to Thailand, I will say, and though I want to make clear that I did not participate in any form of illegal activity in Thailand, it is impossible to avoid seeing the rampant sex trade that goes on in many of the seedier districts of Thailand. So I believe it 100%. James Poulos of blessed memory, who's not with us today, but it will be back. James, I think in the first episode of this podcast, coined the term the Logan's Run effect, which for those of you that have not been with us from those early days, the Logan's Run effect is when some project that is designed to liberate us from the shackles of an earlier age and is sort of excitingly presented to us as this new and glorious future, builds its way up to its exciting conclusion and then suddenly just explodes in, as the movie Logan's Run tells us, a shower of confetti. So there's just this kind of impotence of late liberalism, or whatever you want to call it. So I do kind of think there's a Logan's Run effect in the way that we handle these appointments now. I mean, ostensibly, you sort of think that the system of sort of not having people change over with each administration would lead to greater continuity, would lead to maybe a little bit less sort of partisan hackery and a little bit more sort of merit-based appointment systems and so on. In practice, of course, as all of these kind of grand utopian projects, it's led to precisely the reverse of that. It's led to an entrenched clerisy of sort of appointed elites that feel themselves unaccountable both to any incoming administration and to the people, to the extent that Trump, who has come in with this sort of groundswell of populist support, has been largely unable to accomplish a lot of his sort of most exciting agenda points precisely because he hasn't been able to stack the deck with his own people. Again, people that listen to this podcast will know that I'm reading this Pulitzer novel by Anthony Trollope about the British parliamentary system. And one of the things that does strike you is that each of these lords, who are part, admittedly, of a corruptible patronage system that involves a lot of money and nobility and the changing of hands of sort of hereditary positions, nevertheless, they feel themselves profoundly accountable to the votes of the people, which they must gather if they're going to retain their positions. If they're going to get paid, they have to get voted in each time there's an election. And this move back in the sort of old, ostensibly more partisan direction is, as you say, actually a move back in the direction of something a little bit more accountable and something that potentially has the ability to get more things done. Because if you've got, obviously, an agenda, you're not fighting against your own administration.
No, and given the current size of our executive, of course, we'd have to be prudent about this. You would necessarily want, in our modern era, the president to have complete control over the entire executive branch. It would be amazing.
No, indeed. But who's to imagine that would ever happen,
and
right?
Foul and powerful.
Right.
But and I just want to correct the record on myself, really.
Oh, okay.
And give credit where it's due. Stephen Hollingshead was his name, and actually he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Enforcement at the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Even better.
So it was a HUD employee who had his laptop stolen by a tie hooker and then got fired for it.
Let the record show.
Just these adorning details to the administrative state. And where was it? Was it a DOJ or somewhere that they in one of the Inspector General's report maybe 10 years ago, it turned out a lot of them were watching pornography at the office.
Right.
And that was a big problem.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't even that long ago.
Yeah.
That report was amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, tons of these people were just watching porn at their government job.
Yeah. That's just remarkable.
I mean, there's so many things. One thing is James is not with us. I think he flew too close to the woke sun and exploded this week. No, he's getting some much needed rest and he needs it. He's made the American mind a great thing the last few years, and James has been a champion during this coronavirus thing, as many of you know if you read us. So he's getting some much needed relief. I have to say, I mean, Ryan's introduction, I wonder how many people understand a lot of these issues, which they can be easily explained, but I think that many Americans do not really get or understand the way in which the permanent federal bureaucracy operates. And they know it's a problem, but they think the president's in charge of everything. And we really need presidential leadership and rhetoric to make clear that the guy who tells everyone you're fired, right, can't fire the vast majority of the people in the federal government. And I don't think a lot of even, MAGA, Make America Great Again, Trump supporters understand that in the Trump administration, in its early years, there has been nothing but contention and civil war because many people on the right from DC who had experience went into that administration and disagreed with President Trump, disagreed with the people who elected him, and thwarted his agenda. And so that was from the right. And then you have the problem that every president has, which is that the administrative class is its own class. It's its own fourth branch of government. Its creature is Congress. Congress doesn't pass legislation. It basically is a creature of the administrative state. These people don't leave. And Trump has this serious problem where he can't really change things unless he devotes time and staff energy into basically fighting a war internally, and that is what needs to be done. And I just having went to the same school Ryan did, but what he's talking about is so important. This changed. No one knows that story. No one knows that the Myers case is really holding back the entire country in a way, because the president really isn't in charge of the executive branch. So what do we do about that? And I think this is where the right has failed miserably over the last decades, even though many good and smart people have tried to deal with the problem. We haven't been successful for an entire century in stopping this. And now we have an example where it's just indisputable, if you're of goodwill and open mind, that the administrative state has tried to topple the Trump presidency through lies, through deceit, through some of the worst violations of natural rights you could imagine. What they did to Flynn was horrendous. And people of goodwill, increasingly, the evidence will just grow over the years. I mean, it'll become more obvious, I think, in the history books what happened. So what do you do next? Well, what you have to do is something radical. And as the late Michael Ullman used to say, that the most radical thing you could probably do is have a close look at all the laws and determine where Congress has unconstitutionally delegated its power to the unelected, unaccountable administrative state, and allowed them to legislate basically for Congress. And the executive, Trump, should say, you know what, when it comes to everywhere I've deemed that there's been an unconstitutional delegation of power, I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to fund that. I'm not going to request funding. And I'm going to say, don't enforce these laws. That's number one. And then number two, the Civil Service Reform Act, which was the progressives' great move. And it's understandable, right? They didn't want the corruption that comes of putting your cronies in every time a president wins and firing all the old guys' staff. We need to go back to the spoil system, because I don't see a better way. And I'm curious if you guys have any objections to that. But the problem is that, especially on the right, the cluelessness of the right is thinking that somehow, that's a bad idea. It's already against you. It almost took down Trump. It may prevent Trump from being, a president again. This is the only way that we can reform America, I think, is to allow the executive to have control over hiring and firing the entirety of the federal bureaucracy. And otherwise, we're just playing games, in my opinion.
Well, Matt, I have a question for you, actually, by way of a long-winded response to your question, because it's always by way of something long-winded.
Long-winded rants deserve long-winded responses.
It's here at the Roundtable, that's really what we're about, to be perfectly frank. So I couldn't agree with you more. There was a much lauded op-ed in I guess it was the New York Times not too long ago, about somebody who is insubordinate within the Trump administration, right? I'm trying to undermine the Trump administration from the inside out. Here is my story. And this has become, this has been made actually into a form of heroism. Yeah. It's not just something that we kind of tolerate. It's something that we actively endorse. Celebrate. Right. Mm-hmm. As we have some vague notion that it conforms to the founder's idea of separation of powers or something, which is, of course, laughable. It's intra-power undermining. So I'm with you. You began by talking about messaging, and I think that's the right note to hit. I think it's the crucial failure of the right and the unacknowledged failure of the right in almost every policy area. We're going to talk later about the 1619 Project, but that's a perfect example of the way that the left understands messaging on a fundamental level, and we tend not to. Trump has done some good messaging, I think, throughout this coronavirus crisis, some good, some bad. But there have been moments, at least, like I've said before on this show, his explanation of why he wasn't sort of federally commandeering private companies to respond to coronavirus. That I thought was a great example of sort of very powerful statesman-like messaging. But by and large, it's kind of few and far between. And it's the left that knows how to sell itself in terms that sound like the American ideals, when in fact often they're the precise opposite. And the right is really bad, even if it is defending the American ideal at explaining that it's doing so. Is Trump the guy? Is Trump our guy to kind of try and turn this around? Do you think he just hasn't yet really gotten the message that that's what he needs to do? Do you think he doesn't understand that you can't just have good policies, you also have to explain them in a rhetorically compelling way? I mean, I kind of think this is one of his great strengths, but I also agree with you that we haven't really explained stuff like this to the people. What's the approach here? Do we sort of want Trump to be doing this, or are we looking for a new presidential candidate after hopefully 2 terms of Trump who can sell this stuff in a better way?
Well, I'll jump in on this quickly. I think he's you see in the personnel operation that's underway right now, both with McEntee at the White House and then people at OPM, that they're working on it. And but I think, they're kind of late to the party in a way. I mean, the personnel was always seen as a problem. One of the things that Trump confronted was that there weren't enough people who were willing to work for a Trump administration, and half the ones that were plants, basically, or self-planted plants, were there, to be guardians against what they saw as his dangerous amateurism, wrongly, I think, in most of our opinions. So I think it's going to be a long project. We've mentioned him before, but the late, great Mike Ullman said what he wanted to do was, if he were Trump or writing the speeches about Trump, would just be to tell stories about the abuses of the administrative state, talk about the Hacketts, out on the farmland who have a puddle that forms once a year and is dubbed a water of the United States. And then the feds come in and tell them they can't do anything on it. And then they sue, and $400,000 later and 3 years later, they lost, and they can't vindicate their rights, tell these stories over and over and over again. Right. So that rhetoric, the rhetoric side of it, I think would be story-based. That's what I would make it. We should wrap this segment up, but I just want to say, for those willing to do a deep dive, the 2 famous cases in my mind are Myers v. U.S. That was 1925. We'll put them in the show notes. And then Humphrey's Executor. Actually, Myers was 1926. Humphrey's Executor was 1935. And then just one last story about all this. So, and it gets actually to the problem of the right, Matt, and Matt will know this at least. Humphrey's Executor, where they basically said they weren't overturning Myers but enabled the rise of the independent administrative state, was unanimous. And the opinion was written by George Sutherland, a great expositor of and explainer of the importance of natural rights and the limits of governmental power and the importance of the separation of powers. And in a later case, I think it had something to do with some steamship authority. I could be wrong on the details, but at oral argument, counsel said, blah, 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 blah. It's in but not of the executive branch, or in but not part of the executive branch. And George Sutherland is known to have said, I'm sorry, counselor, did you just say it's in but not part of the executive branch? Where does that constitutional reasoning come from? Please tell me. And he said, well, sir, it comes from your majority opinion in Humphrey's Executor. And then in the notes to it, recounted in some secondary source, it said, Justice Sutherland did not respond. So it's one of these sort of long and winding tales that only graduate students get excited about. But,
does that mean we don't have to read your thesis now, Ryan?
Yes, please don't. But these things have real repercussions.
I told you my level of concern, but you walk by like you never heard. You could bring down my level of concern. Just need you to tell me we're alright, tell me we're okay. Panic on the brain.
Okay, well, we wanted to talk about the subject that no one can avoid, of course, at least for one of our segments, which is The Chinese Communist Party virus. So I spelled it all out that time. It has. I love the iterations of this. The Rona.
The Ron. To do Ron.
We're all sick of this topic at this point.
Oh my gosh.
Those of us who aren't getting illegal haircuts, I'm looking at somebody.
Oh my gosh.
On this virtual podcast.
I am shocked that you would accuse me of such things.
I'm reverting. I'm reverting to our 1979 founding here at the Claremont Institute at an accelerating pace. It's really, really sad.
Are wigs next? Is that what's coming?
Wigs, yeah. No, we're going to go all the way back.
Right.
I was talking to our, we do these weekly calls, Zoom calls with some of our supporters and fellows. And I was talking to RJ Pastrito yesterday, and he said, yeah, it's like living in the Soviet Union. You know, you can get a black market haircut in Hillsdale County, Michigan, but you got to know a guy, and everyone has to pledge that they won't snitch. It's,
my illegal haircut is the best haircut I've ever gotten, if I do say so myself. I think it's
it looks sharp.
Yeah, Ryan looks at me skeptically as I said.
So what's the latest? I mean, we're going to get an announcement tomorrow from Governor Gavin Newsom, who, in a wonderful example of street art that pops up in Southern California, about a week and a half ago when he was issuing his Karen-like lectures about the dangers of opening beaches to Orange County folk. Somebody put up posters of him around LA that said, what did they call it? It was #King Hair Gel, I think, or something like that. And I think the quote was him telling you you're not essential or something like that. But we're going to get an announcement tomorrow about a provisional opening up here in California starting Friday, which will allow many businesses to reopen as long as they can maintain distancing. I think will allow, I still not dine in restaurants, I don't think. We're just getting snippets of all this stuff. Retail, but only for pickup. So, you can go to PacSun to get the latest T-shirt, Spencer, but you're going to have to pick it up outside. I'm sorry. That was a low blow.
Roasted in this opening. I mean, gosh.
I've shopped at PacSun. It's just been a decade.
I'm wearing Banana Republic right now.
I'm joking.
And they're going to go out of business too, Spencer.
Yeah. Were you distraught were you distraught or heartened by the bankruptcy of J. Crew?
Oh my gosh. Deeply, profoundly distraught.
Yeah.
I think I just, it's my birthright to be distraught by such things. And I actually shop at J. Crew a lot.
Oh, okay. No.
This is really, I am roasted.
I'll stop. I'll have to repent for many episodes and not say a critical word of Spencer. I apologize.
Quite to the contrary.
I just got on a roll.
It's great. It's great audio.
So yeah, and then I just wanted to flag one thing, and then we can get into this. I know Matt wanted to talk a bit about freedom in the time of the virus, but in the common sense, practical, Trumpian way of vindication, that is vindication of Trump. There's a study out, and it's not a preprint, it's an actual peer-reviewed article. And it's a study of a little over 1,000 cases in Marseille in France of treatment for patients of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, or the hydroxychloroquine and Z-Pak combo that was being run down by the media. Fauci was saying it's all anecdotal. You can't use that stuff. If you were cropping up on social media as a clinician recommending it, you were getting dropped from YouTube for spreading dangerous and fake news. A lot in some states, actually, doctors were threatened with having their licenses revoked if they were prescribing it. But it turns out, I'll just from the abstract, a total of 1,061 patients were included in this analysis. 46% male, mean age of 43.6 years, range of age 14 to 95. Good clinical outcome and virological cure were obtained in 973 patients within 10 days. That is 91.7%. So the conclusion is that administration of a Z-Pak and hydroxychloroquine is very effective and results in a very low fatality rate amongst patients. And this is it has like 20 co-authors, one of whom I know from friends and acquaintances who know this stuff better than I, is one of the leading, infectious disease experts in the world. So chalk it up to a victory against not expertise or wisdom or even the experts in scare quotes, but against the considered opinion of our elite experts. That is, our professional experts, the ones you see on TV and seem to be directing so many parts of our lives at the moment. So, it's we were asked, again on the same weekly program, asked the other day by one of our fellows, Ross, who runs a very successful political consultancy in Texas, and he wondered whether we ought not to, as conservatives or people on the right, think pretty long and hard about how we should talk about expertise and its rule. Because, and he raised a good point, which is we're not anti-expertise, we're not anti-wisdom ruling when it's actual wisdom. What we're against is the pretensions of an unaccountable administrative state and the pretensions of so-called experts who tend to accrete more and more power to themselves and seems to rule us arbitrarily and to swat away indignantly any challenge to their authority. That's what we're against.
Yeah. I mean, this is going to be perhaps just an extended outline for my next American Mind piece, which, by the way, you can go to AmericanMind.org and find pieces by many people, including me, Matthew Peterson, and James Willis, and David Barr. But yeah, so I was having a long conversation with my parents and my boyfriend the other day about the fact that I've come to feel that science is an op. And I've said this already on the podcast, that science, as currently construed, that what people mean generally in the ruling classes when they say the word science is an op. And again, for our less online listeners, an op is just a kind of end run or a psychological operation that is pulled on unsuspecting and well-meaning individuals who don't know that they're being hoodwinked. Science, as currently described by our expert class, is basically just a big scary word that gets used when it's convenient to make people do what you want them to do. And I was sort of saying, yeah, my new big thing is science is an op. And the people closest to me who love me were saying, do you really want to come out in public and say science is an op when you don't oppose empirical data gathering? You don't impose peer-reviewed, careful studies performed according to the scientific method. You are not an anti-vaxxer.
Depends on where they're peer-reviewed, right?
Right. Well, that's
the Journal of Woke Ethnography.
Right. I mean, thank you. This is precisely the problem, right? We interviewed this lovely doctor, Dr. Gopal, whose pieces are also on the American Mind about transgenderism. And he said exactly that on the subject of transgenderism, what you would call a peer-reviewed article is actually an article that's been vetted by activists before it's been sent in to make sure that the conclusions in it are politically appropriate and endorse the ideology that supports transgenderism as an identity and as something that requires our deference and support. So this is exactly what I'm trying, I guess, to get at, is the fact that there are actually two things here. There's what the word science parades or pretends to mean, which is something legitimate, a legitimate practice in the field of human epistemology, which dates back, by the way, to Pythagoras, right? It's not a kind of new invention with Francis Bacon. It's what the ancients used to call natural science, the process of observing the laws of the way the world works around you. That's a real thing. But the weight of that and the natural importance of such an endeavor has been basically systematically co-opted, and not recently, but for many decades, and in fact, you might even say centuries now, to mean instead just the thing that you have to shut up when I say it because I know more than you. And it's very, very difficult to thread that rhetorical needle, to make that argument in a way that makes clear that you're not anti-science properly understood, but you are anti-science as it's understood everywhere in the entire world. The same is true of a million different words. I think, Matt, you were talking before the show, maybe you want to talk now about liberty as a word that is subjected to this deformation process. A very, very thorny problem to try and address, but I do think it's one that conservatives need to wake up to in this particular moment, because it's going to be important going forward.
And we brought up last week, too, the somewhat jokingly, the invocation of science in a theological manner, right, and the spelling science with the middle of the word left out, like you used to have to spell God or Yahweh in the Bible.
Yep.
And you're right, Spencer. I mean, it is a way to shut people up, right? And it's almost I mean, it is. Well, you're anti-science. It's really a charge of impiety to our modern gods. And I don't want to go far down the rabbit hole of the Marxist analogy of who benefits on all this stuff. But interestingly, so hydroxychloroquine and Z-Pak looks pretty effective. The recommended clinical treatment, the standard of care, as Fauci has called it, is remdesivir, which is made by Gilead and is $1,000 a hit. Unlike hydroxychloroquine, which you can treat, I think, somebody for 30 days for $1,000. So it's our senior fellow John Marini used to say that the social sciences, in the modern sense, in the university sense, which in many ways we got from the German model, starting after the Civil War and then really blossoming during the first half of the 20th century, and now it's just all around us. It's what we live with. Those social sciences are really the applied sciences of the administrative state. But I think with a lot of this, what this virus stuff is exposing is the CDC, the National Institutes of whatever, the NIAHA or whatever it is that Fauci runs, even they are subject to capture. They control an amazing amount of funding, as we know from the whole global warming stuff. So, I mean, even the scientific journals, the peer-reviewed scientific journals, the prominent ones, on a range of issues that are more prone to politicization, should be regarded with a bit of a take them with grains of salt. Mm-hmm. I mean, the funding stream is real. The exertion of pressure over what one can publish and what one can't is real. The sources of funding for your research is very real, and especially in the hard sciences, the federal government on something like immunology, virology, and all this stuff hands out a lot of money and can really make the difference between you making it and hiring a bunch of graduate students and running a whole program or not and getting published. So I think that has to be part of the whole calculation as well. And how does a layman citizen who's supposed to act responsibly in the light of advice from any of these agencies or in the light of his neighbor saying, well, you're anti-science, and trying to just correct people a little bit on how to think about this stuff, it's really a mess. I mean, it's hard to figure out what to do or how to go about doing it. And it's not a good place to be in for a self-governing republic.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say two things. One is in line with just following up on what you're saying. I don't think that our society, the definition of intelligence still for most people, I mean, a lot of people, is still IQ. I mean, people who realize there is such a thing as, inequality in human nature. But the way in which we perceive smartness has to do with numbers, and it has to do with science. And the one thing that was burned into my thick skull in the liberal arts education that I did have is the very true perception, I think, if you study the history of math and the history of science in the West. And it's that the modern social sciences and all this fancy stuff that they put in front of you can be manipulated very easily. Numbers, statistics, all the hypothetical method of modern science, the scientific method. These are all things that are not outside of the old way of thinking about what they used to call natural philosophy. And you can see it in the older scientists. So Darwin could write books that you can have undergraduates read today, and they can understand it without intense specialized knowledge. The early physicists in the early part of the last century, you can read Heisenberg. I mean, for a lot of people, it might be really hard, but you can get to the point where you understand what Einstein is saying. They wrote popular books. They wouldn't be popular today, but they wrote popular books for people, and you can understand this stuff. J. Eric Wise wrote a great article for the American Mind on this, that you could understand what they were saying. They could speak to a popular audience. Why? Not because they were descending from the throne, but because they were describing the context and the way in which they used mathematics. And so here's the key. When people try, I'll give you an example that's obvious, right? Is it Good Will Hunting, where, I mean, there's many movies that do this, where the modern definition of intelligence you see, and it's a bunch of calculations on the board, right? Mm-hmm. And that's almost hilarious because you can get a computer to do that for you, right? And we program the computers. Like the modern definition of intelligence is some kind of mathematical calculation.
Bunch of symbolic math.
Yeah, and that's insane. That's not what any symbolic math that means something actually is a kind of thought about the way in which nature in 3D works. And so math in this sense is a tool that's very powerful that we've harnessed in the modern era. Since Bacon, since Descartes. I mean, we've harnessed math. So it's not just this abstract thing where we're looking at perfect triangles in Euclid. We're using it as a tool. But the thing that I don't think the people understand is it's a very imperfect tool from the beginning. It's not exact, and it's subsumed by all the problems with philosophical understanding and philosophical argument and ideas. It's subsumed within that, and that's a real problem. And that's number one. If we still have time, I'll do a short number two on freedom.
Yeah, do it. I'll just say really quickly that we should, for our more mathematically inclined hard science folks, say that we should draw a distinction, right? And actually, it's interesting in the context of a virus. But physics is pretty precise, especially when it's not theoretical and abstract. And in many ways, the success of the physical sciences, especially physics, was seen by and then mimicked by social scientists at the turn of the 20th century, and especially at mid 20th century. But it's in the social sciences, it's imperfect. You're working with bodies and psychology and souls in a way, and the same thing with virology and immunology. I mean, the biological sciences are more akin in some ways to to the less perfect physical sciences than they are to something like physics, which can really dwell in the realm of physical forces and precise math and get us to the moon. So I just wanted that coda. Sorry, Matt. Go with our notion of liberty these days.
Yeah, but I would want to say that even within the physical sciences, when we apply math to physical things, there's a level of imprecision. And so in other words, like I guess what I would want to say is that you calculus is like this. You can't. It's an approximation, and it's an approximation in physics, exactly like Ryan said, that can get you to the moon. But it's not as if when we use numbers, we're perfectly representing what is in nature. That's all.
Yeah.
And then of course, the big distinction, as Ryan just said, is that when you apply it to human beings, you're in a completely different realm with the social sciences. But here's something I've just been thinking a lot about, because a lot of people on the quote unquote new right, which we are in some ways associated with, have been talking in the last few years about freedom and liberty, and kind of downplaying and ridiculing the way in which your boomer cons or your older people on the right have trumpeted freedom and liberty all the time. And I agree with that. I mean, I think there are all kinds of ways in which the right has just glommed onto this idea of freedom and liberty is always good in a way that's very harmful to society. Freedom doesn't properly mean just doing what you want. But I think what the virus brings back is the notion that freedom is still the basis of virtue, in the sense that without freedom, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. Without freedom, you can't be virtuous. Like at some point, right, you have to be free to exercise virtue, and at some point, you have to be free to have friends and to have all the great goods that flourish as a human being. And the virus brings back, and there's people characterizing this on both sides. The virus brings back this idea, and the right, even the old boomer cons, they're not wrong about this. I know a lot of people with gray hair who I think they're exactly right when they say, how in the hell did everyone just lay back and let this happen? Why don't you think you have a right and maybe even a duty, right, to go out and live your life in the midst of this fear that we see right now? Or why did we lay back so easily? And why did we regard our freedom to live our lives with kind of low esteem, low status? We just laid down very quickly. You can debate about that. the extent to which that is true. There were real fears in the beginning. I understand when the lockdowns happened. But I feel like there's a lot of younger people on the right now who do need to consider that even though the concept of freedom and liberty has been abused by both the left and the right as these kind of mantras that just you can make any argument because everyone wants to be free. You need, if you're in that space, if you're in that younger space and you're against real corruption on right and left, you do need to consider that there is a real role for freedom in the human spirit, and without it, you don't have a lot of the other goods. And I say that as someone who has written about how freedom needs to be channeled, needs to be ordered, and all that kind of thing. I think the virus brings out a kind of populist, popular, old school American, like, wait a minute, what the hell are you telling me? I'm a person, I'm a citizen, I'm part of the society, and I'll figure it out. And I'll say one last thing and then I'll stop. Notice that the experts, all the experts Ryan was just talking about, they're actually not the ones who are going to lead our return to some semblance of normalcy this summer. It's people living their lives who are pushing the politicians who have their fingers in the air. Even Daddy Newsom in California is very worried. He's internal pressure, and he's looking around. He's going, like, I don't want to be the bad guy. People are, he sees us all on his AI chart of all our GPS because he tracks all our phones, and the politicians are seeing Americans are just living their lives anyway, and they're leading the experts. And in fact, when you look at what's happened just in the last period of time since the virus started, the people have been pretty sensible. They lock down fast, right? They're gonna lead the politicians in opening things up a little bit, and then they'll pull back when and if the virus increases. Yeah. Anyway, so you see there's kind of a natural, organic a flow to that, and I don't know. I think we need to talk about this more. We need to distinguish more when we talk about freedom and liberty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it looks like from de Blasio's statements recently, which our producer Jake pointed out to us, he's not talking about a real opening up of New York, at least Manhattan, until September, which is frankly crazy. I mean, Manhattan, which is, both for reasons of size and cosmopolitan and cultural influence, I mean, the sort of epicenter of, I think LA's better bang for the buck, dollar for dollar, but the epicenter of fine dining in America. It'll be pretty interesting. I mean, whatever it's called, is it 51 Madison Park, supposed to be one of the finest restaurants in the world. They're not sure they're ever going to reopen. And I think, especially in a place like Manhattan, a place like San Francisco, where your rent is too damn high all the time. I mean, how many months can you float your existence without any revenue? I just think it doesn't even matter if you charge $700 a meal for a 17-course tasting menu. I think this is just untenable. So, it's just become a weekly rant from us about this.
Counterpoint, if this is helpful to provide a little variety, counterpoint is that my sister and nephew and brother-in-law live in Manhattan, and as long as they are on lockdown, I am teaching my nephew remote Latin lessons.
How old is he, Spencer?
He's all of 6 years old. So but he's doing a great job. I doubt they listen to this podcast, but wow, I'm shocked. He's learned the first conjugation. He's learned a number of vocabulary words. We're gonna do declensions probably this week, and so there is the silver lining of Latin lessons.
I took Latin in middle school, and my mother got me a Latin for all occasions book, and I think my favorite one was Semper Sub Ubi, which
Semper Ubi Sub Ubi.
Always wear underwear.
Always wear underwear. Correct.
That's good stuff.
You lie like a priceless Persian rug on a rich man's floor, and you lie like a coon dog basking in the sunshine on my porch, where you lie like a penny in a parking lot at the grocery store. It just comes way too natural to you, the way you lie.
Well, for our final segment today, we wanted to remark upon, as I've teased already, the absolutely ridiculous but perfectly predictable and inevitable, really, in our current times, awarding of the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. I put that decidedly in scare quotes, to the Nicole Hannah-Jones of New York Times' 1619 Project. And as we were Googling and looking around, I naively said, I think the Pulitzers these days are $15,000. So I said, well, at least she didn't get a MacArthur Genius Grant. That's real money. And my hopes were dashed when it was pointed out to me that, in fact, Nicole Hannah-Jones is also a MacArthur Fellow, joining the ranks of the thoroughly overrated and equally charlatanish Ta-Nehisi Coates as a recipient of $1 million grant for being, the colloquial name for that grant is the Genius Grant. What to say? I'll just plug again. I encourage everyone to go to AmericanMind.org, click listen at the top, and then scroll down to one podcast down at the moment, maybe two after we post this, where you have a 1619 special podcast from us. If you're a subscriber, you can just go into the archives. A couple episodes back, you'll see 1619. If you haven't listened, please do. I did a radio spot today about it, actually, and for a Colorado station, and she recommended, and I think this is a great idea. She said, you guys are great. It's wonderful. I learned a lot. It's a long slog at an hour and a half. Do 10-minute serialized versions. And so maybe we will. It's not, it's not free to do these things, but it's not a bad idea, actually. This problem's not going away. Nicole Hannah-Jones, one more silver lining of the coronavirus. She was on a nationwide tour to hawk 1619 to schools for curricular reasons. And so that's been halted by the virus. So that's good too. Although it's already been adopted, we know from our friend Inez Felcher-Stepman, who tracks this stuff on the education policy beat, that it's already at 3,500 schools, so K through 12. Teaching what can only be described as an anti-American op. It's not history. It's really ideologized and politicized agitprop of the worst kind, and really meant to undermine our love of country and to replace it with a whole new system of justice based on group rights and social justice, and replace capitalism with some form of racialized socialism. Just go down the line. It's really sad. Sorry, David. Just one last thing. I forget who wrote this, but it's perfect actually. The point of the Pulitzers, in many senses, not always, of course. Sometimes they actually, like a broken clock, hit the right time a couple of times, not a day, but maybe a year. But I don't want to run down all Pulitzers, but they're, especially on these really political topics, it's meant more than anything else. So this whole project was assaulted by historians, many of whom were not conservatives or right-wingers or, Trumpsters or anything, who just said it's bad history, it's dishonest. When it was critiqued, it kind of really didn't deal with the critiques. Nicole Hannah-Jones, for anyone who follows her on Twitter, is a pretty nasty piece of work, snarky and sarcastic and dismissive. And even the sort of New York Times editorial staff didn't really correct the record when they were challenged by eminent historians. So this Pulitzer Prize is really meant to launder otherwise bad and shoddy work into respectability, and to help spread it far and wide to our increasingly, it's sad to say, I used to say this just of the elite universities, but now it's true of K through 12 in our public school systems in many of our states, if not most. The little seminaries of anti-Americanism. Our whole educational system is trending in that direction, and so Anyway, sorry, David, I interrupted you.
No, I interrupted you. I apologize. I just want to, so I didn't forget, but we need to stay vigilant about this kind of thing.
Yeah.
I know that in some of the more snarky corners of Twitter, people will react to some of what we've published regarding 1619 as saying, well, this is your typical reactionary right. They're overstating the problem, blah, blah, blah. But I'm 35 years old, and I remember with great clarity at a public high school in Bethesda, Maryland, working through Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States,
yep.
which is kind of a precursor or set the stage for these Nicole Hannah Smiths.
It's wrong, but keep going. Don't correct it.
No, right. So that Zinn book made a major impact. It was cited in Good Will Hunting. We were talking about that movie earlier.
Yeah.
And so
such BS too. Gordon Wood is so great.
Yeah.
He actually is pretty solid. And Good Will Hunting is so wrong there. It's terrible. Anyway.
This crashes upon our intellectual shores like successive waves, this rewriting of American history. And if you just look, you can't kind of give up on pushing back, even though it seems like a fool's errand. So.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad that we're talking about this, because I feel a little bit like that Simpsons meme, old man yells at cloud. If our listeners are online, they'll have seen this. It's Grandpa Simpson shaking his fist at a cloud, and that's the story in the newspaper. One often feels that way when confronted with the 1619 Project because of the vast weight and apparatus of just cultural clout that has been mounded behind this thing in direct defiance of its factual inaccuracies, not in ignorance of those inaccuracies, not because nobody knew that this is a falsehood and a lie and propaganda and agitprop, as has been said now on this podcast multiple times. It's not because they didn't know that that was true, that they did this. They did this because they knew that that was true. They gave it the Pulitzer because they knew that this thing doesn't stand on its own, because they knew that it misrepresents American history. They knew that Nicole Hannah-Jones is not a historian. She's a pundit. She's a rabble-rouser, and she knows almost nothing, in fact, about colonial American history. They knew that, and so they marshaled all of their cultural apparatus. And it is formidable now, right? It includes not just the Pulitzers, although that's hugely important, but also the public schools and also the New York Times itself. The left has purposefully, in a kind of Alinsky-esque way, right? Alinsky's Rules for Radicals was very explicit about how this was supposed to work. They've taken over our modes of cultural legitimation and they've made them their own. And they use them now to cover over the fact that their ideas suck. And so the fact that this has been debunked on the World Socialists website, and the fact that this has been debunked in the Atlantic, and then by Sean Valence, by not right-wing people, by folks that are sympathetic to the social justice claims of the 1619 Project, the fact that all of that has happened and that this has been thoroughly excoriated, met with, as I think James said at one point, a buzzsaw of factual inaccuracy, that has not made a dent. And that, too, was by design. It doesn't matter that we've shown that our arguments are better. It matters that the Pulitzers have done this, and we've got to realize that. We've got to figure out how we're gonna fight back against this. Matt, go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you.
That's absolutely right. Let me just blackpill people a little bit, though, a little more on this. And this is, again, Americans don't realize this. Look, we rejected our history over a century ago, and the idea that this is new. It's new because it transgresses boundaries, and it's obvious if you're of goodwill. Doesn't care about the truth at all. But here's the problem. Americans forgot who they were a long time ago and have tried to recover it. And the example I always give, she's talking about 1619 instead of 1776. Look, 1776, the Revolution, the first big book that looks at the ideas of the Revolution by Bernard Bailyn, an old Harvard historian, who I think is still alive, haunting the library at Harvard. I think he's still in his 90s, right?
I think he's still alive, yeah.
Yeah, dude, I emailed with him a few years ago.
Yeah.
Still kicking.
So Bernard Bailyn in the 60s, he publishes a book called The Ideological Origins of the Revolution. And what's crazy about it is, in the 60s, he makes this radical suggestion. He doesn't even say ideas or principles. He says ideological origins. Up until that time, people denigrated the idea that the American Revolution happened because of ideas or principles, right? And then in the ideological origins of the Revolution, what Bailyn discovers, because he actually goes back and reads the pamphlets of the Revolution, which hadn't been done by a lot of people for nigh on 100 years, he discovers, his conclusion is, these guys might have actually meant what they said. They had these real arguments and ideas for why they revolted. And that was a huge moment in American history. And I'm not joking about this. I mean, I'm making a cartoon of it, slightly, but this is actually the case. That was a revolutionary book. And it led to Gordon Wood and many of the historians who have responded to 1619. And why did they respond to 1619? Why do they know? How do they know that this was wrong? Because they actually spent time reading this wonderful founding that we have, where you can actually access the texts of a founding of a country that's very rare in human history. You can actually read what people said when they created a nation. And they did that in the 60s and 70s, and they found all kinds of marvelous stuff. And as they were doing that, there were other people like Harry Jaffa and many people influenced by Leo Strauss doing the same, reading these texts carefully. But America hadn't done that for a long time. And that's what I think a lot of people don't understand. So now we're at the point where it's just clown world. I mean, we were talking before the show. She receives $1 million to be a MacArthur Fellow. She's just saying whatever the Politburo wants her to say. But what we have to realize is it hasn't been a long tradition of America teaching about itself. We just started to rediscover ourselves over the last 50 years on the right, and we need to nurture that.
I thought you were going to bring up Charles Beard, Matt, as just as the example of how this happens every so often.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. I mean, in the Industrial Revolution period, we just rejected any idea that the principles or the ideas were important. And Charles Beard is someone who, Ryan and I both have read him, and he rejects the notion of the common good. He's very much, kind of a watered down American Marxist in the early part of his career. And he writes a book that says, look, the American founding was all about economic interest. That's all it was. It's in line with the social sciences at the time that want to quantify everything. And it makes a big splash. And in other words, that was over a century ago, though, right? I mean, so that was the American elite back then. So we started to recover ourselves fairly recently on the right, and then the left is just in a place where this is all just propaganda. That's my understanding.
Yeah, and at mid-century or so, I believe, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but Jaffa's favorite whipping boy on
Becker,
on the Declaration. Yeah, Carl Becker writes a book on the Declaration of Independence, in which he says to ask if the principles of the Declaration of Independence are true is to ask a meaningless question. So that the old materialist explanation for all this has kind of carried the day for a long time, and breakthrough scholarship used to be easier, Matt, at mid-century. If you're a historian, you just go back and read the documents and take them seriously as if the people who wrote them might have meant them. Yeah.
I would say so. One of our fellows, I don't know if I can mention her name. Actually, I haven't asked for approval, but one of our fellows was just. She said, we have over 700 Claremont fellows in these incredible programs we bring people here in the summers for. And she was saying she was reading the founding era sermons that Liberty Fund has. Liberty Fund has a 2-volume collection.
Yeah,
of
wonderful collection.
Sermons.
Magnificent.
Yeah.
And when you read these sermons, you see this was not just some atheistic Enlightenment John Locke. I mean, these guys were serious about their faith. And she was saying, I'm reading this, it's incredible. I would say it's still the case that all kinds of young minds could look back at this stuff and just discover interesting things. It was an interesting period, and it's rare that you have these documents. On Becker, we have to say, remember, Jaffa's point was in Becker's first book on the Declaration, which is one of the first serious scholarly efforts to talk about the Declaration. Just think about this, right? In the Progressive era, so it's 100 and some years that have gone by since the Declaration is issued and makes the country revolts, kind of signing the document. You have the first major scholarly statement by Carl Becker, and in that book he says what Ryan says. He says it doesn't matter, of course, whether it's true or not. What's true doesn't matter. I mean, kind of all law is positive. Truth doesn't matter at all. But then when it gets nearer to World War II, World War II is on, or I think it's just before, and Hitler is starting to become a threat. Becker changes his, I think it's the preface to the book, and he says, we're thinking more seriously now about old ideas.
Right.
We're thinking more seriously now about things that we took for granted. And the same thing, by the way, I think in a lesser sense happens to the progressive historian Charles Beard.
Yeah.
In other words, as the century got more serious and you're faced with, life or death or regime level circumstances, you can see the scholarship going, maybe, some ideas do kind of matter.
Yeah.
It's very easy in a time of luxury to say, well, people think different things. And It's all fine.
Yeah. To give Beard his credit, he recanted in a way later with his book called The Republic.
Yes.
So that's right.
I mean, just to point out, Matt, you're making such a fantastic point, and it hasn't actually occurred to me really until this very moment as I hear you making it. Every regime needs a founding myth and a myth of the founders and a way to enshrine the people that set the parameters of the regime in this place of kind of high honor. And the Greeks knew this, right? I mean, the Katistes, the founder, is a figure of mythological reverence in Greek.
Is it a god, stranger?
Lore. Right, exactly. But they had to invent this stuff, right? I mean, Solon, Plato in the Timaeus has to invent a story about Solon going back to the Egyptians and learning from their ancient lore, because the Greeks say the Egyptians in the Timaeus are just too young in soul to really have true founding, and so Solon kind of accumulates this ancient wisdom from the Egyptians and passes it on to Greece. Fine, right? That's a way of doing it. That's a kind of noble lie, as Plato would, of course, later, or rather would say around the same era. But we actually have these guys, right? They're actually here. We're inured to it because of how ubiquitous it is in our national lore. But it's a remarkable fact.
You can read it. I mean, this is the thing. What Ryan was talking about earlier, the rise of the administrative state. What he's been working on with Taft, et cetera. You can go back to these cases. There's tons of documentation as to how this happened and why and what the arguments were made on both sides. You can go back to the founding of the country and find that. People have not even plumbed those depths.
Right.
And this is something just we really need to emphasize, because people think like there's these expert scholars and they're out there and they already know this stuff and they disagree on this stuff that they have a comprehensive knowledge of. They don't. Like you can't even read all the text from the founding. There's so much of it. And we haven't even plumbed those depths. So there's official volumes from the first 5 presidents or so that are not even complete. Like the official volumes of Madison's correspondence are not even compiled. Think about how insane that is. So probably no one has read, everything that guy has written. And that's the kind of thing that we just need to seed that idea in a lot of young, intelligent minds. Look, this is an open field, and it's very interesting because it's rare in human history, as you say, Spencer, that you can look back at this.
Just to plug our own stuff, we're running long, but for those interested in Howard Zinn, there's this excellent new book out by Mary Graeber called Debunking Howard Zinn, exposing the fake history that turned a generation against America, to pick up on one of David Barr's points. And, of course, we've reviewed it in the Claremont Review Books, and actually this issue, right? The title is, and you can just Google it or go to ClaremontReviewBooks.com, The Disgraceful Howard Zinn is the name of the review, and it's reviewed by an eminent Lincoln scholar, among other things, Michael Burlingame. And so, I mean, what can you say? I mean, I just wanted to make one final point about 1619. Sometimes for our listeners that don't know us as well or don't know the Claremont Institute as well, it's easy to say, well, what are they talking about, that the 1619 Project's a political op? But there's this leaked audio, which we discussed in the podcast, and I forget if they meant for it to be leaked or it was leaked. I don't remember the details, but it doesn't matter. Dean Baquet, who is the publisher of the New York Times, he's the publisher, right?
I believe so. You're putting me on the spot now, but yes, I think you're right.
It's my further trolling of Spencer. I'll blame it on him.
This is just the constant. You all know that.
No, Dean Baquet is in some leadership role at the New York Times. He may be the publisher, but there was this session where they talked about their editorial stance and the position of the paper and what they should do at a certain point in recent history in the last year, maybe 8 months ago, 6 months ago. And he said, look, Russia collusion and impeachment, Russia collusion has collapsed. It was maybe pre-Ukraine. Russia collusion's collapsed. Impeachment doesn't seem to be going too many places. So we need to shift. And the place we need to shift is to Trump as a racist. Becquet didn't quite put it that way, but it's what he meant. And he said, of a piece with all this is our 1619 project, which is, so you just get the sense that the mainstream, the formerly gray lady, the paper of record, is back in the yellow journalism business, and it's the ideological yellow journalism business. I probably don't have to tell any listeners to this podcast that the New York Times, especially the editorial page, has a decidedly political slant that even bleeds over into their actual reporting. But don't take our word for it. It's their own admission that this, the 1619 has as much to do with 2020 and Donald Trump as it does with their view of American history and what they want to teach to those of us out there trying to study it, including our children, unfortunately. Well, with that, thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, and claremontreviewbooks.com. Don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to our production and engineering team, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. James, we miss you. We'll see you next week, and we'll talk to all of you next week.
But nobody's kidding nobody about where it goes. I'm sitting down here in the campfire light, searching for the ghost of Tom.
Spencer has, in fact, given me a typology of Karens by text. And Haley/Kaylee/Maylee.
That's the best one.
Is 0 to 18 years old, Karen. 19 to 35, of course, is Becky. Karen is 35 to 45. Susan is 45 to 60. And Gertrude, who's holding a pistol in this typology, is 65 plus.
Gertrude's the one that I want to hang out with.
Yeah, she's actually not a Karen.
Right.
That's actually improper.
Yes.
Because no hectoring.
Gertrude is probably based.
Yeah,
great.
no hectoring Karen would be holding a weapon. He's just a poor country academic trying to understand the world.
Just Dr. MJP. Just Doc MJ.
The drink I invented, the ventilator. So I ditched the ginger liqueur because it was too obscure. But it's an ounce of grapefruit, an ounce of lemon, an ounce of lime.
This is like my dream.
Yeah, but
That's right there.
so I should go step by step. So it's depending on who you are, 3 ounces of gin, 2 healthy slices of jalapeno, a couple sprigs of cilantro, and some smashed basil in your shaker. Muddle it aggressively. Let it sit while you juice your grapefruit, your lemon, and your lime, 1 ounce each. And then shake the fruit juice and that stuff over ice. So you shake all that, you strain it into a new glass with ice, you put a little bit of Lillet in it, and then top it with tonic. And it's pretty good.